Welcome to the Popcorn Counter here at the Two Real Cinema Club. I'm James Rosica.
And I'm Andres Lorente. Two separate people, you and I. But sometimes I wonder if, like, some of these people around here, because this is a weird theater you bring me to.
It is a weird. You're exactly right. It is a weird. But it's the only one that will let us in.
Yeah, but don't you ever get the idea that some of these people have been put together using the parts of various cadavers around this town? Like that dude over there.
You think, was that just from looking at people or from smelling them?
No, it's no smell. We all smell bad. I'll acknowledge that. But some people, like, the arms don't quite match up, or then there's the stitch marks on the face. That's always a giveaway. This place is full of Frankensteins.
It's the little details. It's the little details, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Frankenstein is like over 2 centuries old now, isn't it? It was 1818.
Yeah.
It came out. Was there some kind of celebration actually in 2018? I don't remember anything being made of it.
No, it was written by a woman. No celebration.
Of course, why would we celebrate women's literature? But it's like having just come out of Poor Things. I've been thinking about how often Frankenstein is basically reused and retold as a movie. It's been told like so many times, and not just as a Frankenstein film. There was when we were talking about how there's the Kenneth Branagh film with Robert De Niro, isn't there? I can't remember who else is in that. And I've seen that because I can remember some images for it, but I cannot remember a great deal about the film at all, except that I do clearly remember you telling me that it was bad.
I thought it was bad. I didn't like it. De Niro as the monster was very strange to me.
He's not a big man, is he, De Niro? And somehow I seem to remember they tried to make him look big by just putting the camera closer, right, I guess?
Yeah, and you were complaining about his range recently when we talked of Killers of the Flower Moon. So, I mean, I think the monster takes a lot of range. There's a lot of growth in the arc of the story for that character. So I think he was the wrong part. I think it was mostly De Niro that made it bad for me. I mentioned in the pod, it's a fantastic book. I love this book. And I used it a lot for a story that I wrote, a script that I wrote as well. So I think it's hard to do it service, though. It's a big book. I mean, it's several hundred pages. It's dense, it's flowery. The language is fantastic. So it's one of those things. I always think it's really a mistake to take a great book and turn it into a film, and yet think of how many films have come out of Frankenstein.
The one that really occurs to me is things like Robocop, isn't it? I remember a friend of mine years ago, a friend of my brother's, that's it, who was kind of a bit of a film buff. Yeah. And I remember him kind of sneering at a friend. You know, he was telling me the story about how he met, like, you know, a friend of a friend who told him, "Oh, you like movies? I love movies. What's your favorite movie?" "My favorite movie is Robocop." And my brother's friend kind of really sneering at this, saying, "What a ludicrous thing. Obviously, this guy doesn't love movies." And actually, I rather love Robocop. And it's a great Frankenstein story. It manages to get all of those Frankenstein beats in. Yeah. You know, along with a bit of satire and some extreme ultraviolence. You know, what's not to like? Yeah,
I mean, I think for me also just like the more literal ones, the Boris Karloff Frankenstein from way back when, you know, the man of many monster faces. Those are the classic ones, right? That really kind of tell the story pretty straight up. And I've seen that one recently, but I've also seen, I think we talked about this on the pod too, Bride of Frankenstein, which is a James Whale film, which is...
Ah, yes!
We talked about this a little while ago because I saw it on 16mm, and it was great. It's not a very long film, as I recall. I saw it around Halloween, so it was just a few months ago. And just the effects, the technical effects in that film, given that time, it must be 1930s or early 40s anyway, were marvelous. And obviously, you know, there was... I think Frankenstein really lent itself to that silent age because you've got a character who can just grunt and groan a little bit, and you've got established literature to base it on. So there are a lot of Frankensteins from that period of cinema, I think. So, and then, you know, of course, sometimes they get played out. Bride of Frankenstein 2 or Frankenstein 4, like the Rocky series or something like that. But
Frankenstein the Divorce, yeah.
Exactly. You know, they're sort of milking it for what it's worth. But so I think some of the straight interpretations of Frankenstein are really, really good and iconic. Young Frankenstein, did we talk about that?
Yes, less straight interpretation, yes.
But very funny, very clever, black and white. Stylistically, it's fantastic. So that's another take on it. So I think it's good source material because it does have, it's the life that keeps on living. You can bring it back to life. It's consistent with Frankenstein himself, right? So you can rework it, and I know that we can talk about some other reworkings of it. What else comes to mind for you?
I don't want to keep repeating 1980s science fiction films, but I think Blade Runner is basically Frankenstein, isn't it? I think it's all to do with creating people and the morality of creating a life, and being the person who makes the decision about who lives and who does not, or creating a creature which has agency. It's all that's Frankenstein. That is Blade Runner, isn't it?
Yeah.
The other one, which also really reminds me of Frankenstein, is The Fly, isn't it? Which is somehow a man is created, but he's created using parts of a different creature as well, which gradually take over. I mean, these are just repetitions of that single fundamental idea, but it's such a vivid, powerful little story that you can retell it in 100 different ways.
Yeah.
When I was a boy, I loved $6 Million Man.
Oh, yes.
Back when it was on telly. I watched a little clip of it on YouTube the other day, actually. I was curious to see what it still looks like. And there was a YouTube video called Best of $6 Million Man. And I kid you not, it was basically 4 straight minutes of Lee Majors jumping really high in the air. That was what the guy who made the video thought that was the best of the $6 Million Man.
In hindsight, yeah, it probably was. Boy. But there was the Bionic Woman, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she did also feature in some of the clips, but she was only allowed to jog. So Lee Majors was jumping, but Jamie Summers was only jogging. That's the big difference between men and women. I think it was a particular episode of The $6 Million Man, which I must have seen when I was like 8 years old or something like that, which really stuck in my mind because I think it formed the basis of a good half a dozen different stories and scripts that I kind of tried to develop, which is a scene where Lee Majors has kind of seen off the bad guys, but I think he has amnesia, or he doesn't really quite understand what's happened. Maybe it's from the pilot episode, possibly. But he gets an injury to his arm, and he kind of peels back the skin, and there's machinery underneath it. And he looks at whoever he's with, and he kind of says, "I'm a machine." And I remember that this moment being seared into my brain. I've used something very similar, several times. I've openly stolen that scene several times because I love this notion of someone discovering for the first time something very different about what they thought the world was like. Yeah, it's a great dramatic moment, and it's absolutely Frankenstein, isn't it?
Yeah, and potentially becoming more common with the advanced prosthetics and digital implants and whatnot. I mean, it's the life that we might have here eventually.
And that guy who got his brain substituted for a goat's brain, you're right. Yeah, it's absolutely, that's the world we live in now. I was trying to think about where, kind of what the origin of the Frankenstein story was, because originally written by Mary Shelley, but do we know that she came up with the idea independently, or was this a notion which had already been explored in previous books or plays? I don't know, but I did a little bit of reading. And first of all, I'm guessing that Ovid's Metamorphoses are effectively, a kind of Frankenstein story, are they not? It's to do with animation and reanimation. A statue comes to life. Well, that's kind of what Frankenstein is. And even before that, actually, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Well, Eve is a kind of Frankenstein character who's been created from a bit of Adam. Sure. So this actually is a story as old as humanity. This is a story which we have been telling, since stories were first told. It's a straight line, I think, from the story of Adam and Eve to the story of The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg. They're basically the same story, I like to think.
Straight line to
straight
Cronenberg.
Line.
Yeah, from Bible, Ovid, Cronenberg. Yeah. She also called it the modern Prometheus. So I think she was also focusing on this idea that the doctor, one single man, would be fooling around with the God's work of creating humans. And so it's called Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So it's interesting because I think both the monster, as we call him, has definitely captured human imagination. But also there's this idea of a doctor or someone in a position of science or medicine being able to do godlike things. So it works on a couple of different levels, which is lovely. And it's definitely become, like a very, pardon the pun, immortal theme.
Yeah, it remains very modern, doesn't it?
That goes through literature and film. And that's the thing that it interests me, is that it's generally considered a kind of morbid, like a monster story. And I think it's about our own mortality, ultimately. I mean, we'd love to think that there's a heaven, or that we can come back to life. And here, Frankenstein represents this, maybe even if it's in just bits and pieces of other bodies, or in some other way that we can have another life after this one. And I think that's probably why it's so stuck in our imagination. It's so popular. For me, there's a Christian thing to it. And this is kind of what I tried to explore in my script, my Frankenstein script, is that everlasting life, and actually being able to come back to life. And you can see these images of Frankenstein on the operating board, very much like on the cross, beat up body that's about to be rejuvenated. So for me, it was sort of a combination of this sort of Christian story, but also, you would have guessed this, I think of it as a socialist thing too. Jeez, crow. Back to the stupid socialism. Just these different body parts, these different individual parts coming together to work as this new whole that will experience or create a new world. And so for me, I think that's probably not the way most people look at Frankenstein, but that's definitely an angle for me. And then there's one more thing you talked about Blade Runner, and one thing Blade Runner is one of those things where I have read the book and seen the movie. Oh. So I just want to say that, because I sometimes read books and sometimes read books.
The Serial Cinema Book Club.
Yes. What's it called? Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I think that's a really interesting piece there too, because you've got these androids, these creations, and if we want to call them Frankensteins, they've been recreated, reanimated. And what do they need? They need a religion too, which is very odd. And then what do they revere? They revere the sheep. And what is the sheep? It's Jesus. So, I mean, that very interesting that, these, as life forms, we need something else to believe in, because the miracle of life itself is not quite enough. So we end up revering something. And what is it in that film? I don't know if it's in the film. That's the thing. Is the most interesting thing for me was the book. I loved the worshiping of the sheep. And I think the people had, if you had enough money, you could get this electric sheep, and it would live on your rooftop, and you'd go up and kneel to it, genuflect, and worship this thing on the roof of your building. It was left out of the film, which I think would have been great, but
I think 96% of the book is left out of the film, isn't it? I think the film is basically based on like a fairly short 4-page section of the actual book.
Okay, yeah. Well, I remember that as being a really interesting thing, and I remember seeing the film and being disappointed. Jeez. Anyway, so I just mentioned Jesus, socialism, and electric sheep.
Your script was called Some of the Parts. Is that right? Some of the Parts.
Yeah.
It's a clever pun. It's clever. That needs to find an audience, that script. Can you remind me, like in 2 or 3 sentences, what was the story of Some of the Parts?
Some of the Parts is sort of this cult leader who has died. I think it was flesh-eating virus or something like that. And then he worked for like a prosthetics. He'd founded this philanthropic institute that treated burns and created prosthetics. And then his followers, and I call it a reverse Frankenstein because he's kind of the original creator, but then his followers freeze his head and bring him back to life by harvesting new body parts.
Oh.
And then he reanimates, they get him reanimated, and then he hates his original creation. He hates the cult that he formed. So, and then he ends up becoming part of the lobstering community where he lives, where he set up this, and he was hated in the community before, but he becomes this new person, and he brings all sort of the parts of the community come together in this socialist overtaking of the culture.
Man, that's
socialists again.
That reads like a very contemporary idea, man. That feels so now.
It is, but there are no cell phones in it, so I'd have to rewrite it with cell phones.
Yes. Yeah, just put a few references to the App Store in the script, and no one will notice. But you could rewrite. Make sure it's a retro script. Just say these events occurred in 1995.
Well, yeah. All of my scripts are sort of frozen between 1999 and 2008. There's a kind of very narrow window where I can write. So
it's just got to be pre-smartphone. That's the only thing. Pre-smartphone.
Exactly, pre-smartphone. Yeah, but again, it was because of reading the book. I realized I was looking for the piece that I needed to bring the whole idea together, and Mary Shelley's book did that. Or Mary Wollstonecraft, I guess we should really call her.
You've reminded me of the other Frankenstein film that I haven't mentioned, which is Tetsuo Iron Man. Have you seen that?
No.
Which is like a super low budget Japanese film about this guy who's like a scientist, but he ends up somehow melding together with his own electronics experiment and becoming this kind of weird hybrid human come electronic man. I'm just thinking, if you remade that now, clearly he would meld with his iPhone, wouldn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
But, absolutely. He would become an app.
Yeah, and I think you could make that argument that we're all Frankenstein already.
Ah, yeah. Well, your smartphone is already kind of an extension of your own memory, isn't it?
Yeah.
You don't need to remember things now because you have a smartphone that will remember it for you.
Yeah, precisely.
So we are all Frankenstein now. We're all Frankenstein, and who is our creator? It's Steve Jobs.
Yes, he's the doctor.
So actually, that Steve Jobs movie, that was a Frankenstein movie as well.
I guess,
but we didn't realize it at the time.
We didn't. It's focusing on Victor Frankenstein, not the monster. Yeah, and I think these films are going to be made until we're long gone. It's just an immortal, timeless kind of theme that will go on and on. But with good reason. It comes from great literature, and it will endure.
As if great literature ever had anything to do with cinema.
Nothing whatsoever.
we should go and see the film.
Yeah, or go read a book. Maybe we should. Yes. I got to catch up on your reading schedule. I'm going to go read a book. You go watch this film.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. You could be the 2 Real Book Club next week.